welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing really well today. So I am back today with a new sewing project and I am so excited about this project. I am wearing it at the moment and this was such a fun dress for me to work on. I've recently been getting really into looking up vintage Laura Ashley dresses on Etsy and eBay or anywhere that you can find vintage clothing. And I've been particularly really enjoying looking at the ones from the 70s, but they are always really far out of my budget. So I thought it would be really fun to try and make my own. So after doing a little bit of research, I found that you could find sewing patterns that were Laura Ashley designs from the 70s. So I got this one on Etsy. My mom actually has a few from the 80s, but this was the style of dress that I was more interested in making. So I thought I would get my own. And then I also was able to find vintage Laura Ashley fabric on Etsy, which I used to make this dress. So I will link to some similar things down below in case you're curious to check those out. But let me go ahead and jump in and show you how I made this dress. The fabric that I've chosen for this project is this beautiful vintage Laura Ashley cotton from the 90s. I found this on Etsy. It's this really pretty mauve color with a ditzy floral pattern. I'm also using a vintage Laura Ashley pattern. Again, this is from Etsy, and this is McCall's number 4547. I love the Regency elements of this style. I will be making the longer view and also doing my best to follow along with the techniques that are listed in the pattern guide so that I can make it as true to the original style as possible. Now, my fabric came in 4 separate cuts that were about 2 yards in length. So instead of cutting out my fabric on the fold, I've layered these pieces together 2 at a time, just so I have a wider width to work with here. And then I'm just laying out as many pattern pieces as I can fit on each section and then cutting out my pattern pieces. One thing that I found quite interesting about this pattern is that it offers 2 options for the bodice front piece. One is designed with standard ease and the other is a little bit smaller, and the pattern guide says this is supposed to give more of the Laura Ashley designer look. Now, because I find vintage patterns to run a little bit small as a general rule, I decided to go with the piece with the standard ease just so I wouldn't risk it not fitting. So with everything cut out, here is a quick look at the pattern pieces. First, there is the skirt front and back pieces, then the sleeve, bodice front and bodice back, and then also a drawstring, a neck casing, and then a waist tie piece that I ended up omitting in the end. So now to get started sewing the dress, the first step is to run gathering stitches along the bottom of the bodice front. I'm going to run 2 rows of gathering stitches and 2 sets of gathering stitches between the markings on the pattern piece. Now, since we're making a 70s pattern today, it seemed only appropriate to use my 70s sewing machine, so I'm going to use this sewing machine exclusively today and not use my serger. And with the gathering stitches set in, now I can move on to assembling the bodice. So I'm going to start by sewing the shoulder and side seams of the bodice, but today I'm going to use French seams for my bodice. Since I'm using a standard sewing machine, I thought this would be a nice way to finish these seams. So I'm going to start by pinning these seams together with the wrong sides together instead of the right sides. Then I will sew these down with half of the standard seam allowance. So that's right around 1/4 of an inch. Next, I'm going to trim away as much of the excess seam allowance as possible, cutting right up to my stitching without cutting through the stitching at all. Now I'm just going to press that seam to one side to make it easier to fold into my French seam. Next, I'm going to fold along the stitching line and then pin this in place. Then I'll take this over to the sewing machine and sew it down with another 1/4 of an inch seam allowance to create my encased French seam. So now the bodice is pretty much assembled, and I'm going to move on to working on the neckline edge. So this neckline features a drawstring, which I think is a really interesting detail. That's something you see in a lot of Regency era clothes. And the first step to creating the casing for the drawstring is to fold under the neck edge 1/4 of an inch and press this down. Next, I'm moving on to work with the 2 casing pieces for the neckline. These are cut out on the bias, which allows them to fit to the neckline really nicely. And the first thing I'm going to do with these pieces is just fold under one of the edges twice to create a narrow hem on the short edge. And after stitching that hem in place, I'm going to fold these pieces in half along the long edge and press them down. Then to keep the edge of this from fraying, I'm just going to run some zigzag stitches all the way down the long raw edge of these pieces. So now I'm going to pin the 2 casing pieces to the neckline edge. And to do this, I'm overlapping the neckline of the bodice over the zigzag edge of the casing and matching up the short raw edge of the casing with the back of the dress. That will allow that little hem that we stitched earlier to meet in the middle of the neckline, and that's where the drawstring will be tied into a bow. So here's what it looks like with the 2 casing pieces pinned in place. You can see that that hem meets in the middle, which will allow us to add a drawstring later. So now I'm just going to top stitch this down all the way around the neckline edge. Next, I'm going to make the drawstrings, and I did change this up just a little bit from the original pattern instructions. Because my fabric is a little bit thicker, I thought this method might work a little bit better. So I'm going to start by folding my drawstrings with the right sides together and sewing them into a tube. Then I'm going to trim away any of the excess seam allowance and turn the tube right side out using a safety pin. After giving the drawstrings a quick press, I'm just going to use a knitting needle here to turn in one of the edges just a little bit to almost create a hem here and conceal the raw edges. Then I'll come back later and sew this with a couple of hand stitches. Next, I'm just going to take my drawstring and insert it into the casing using a safety pin, making sure that the raw edge of the drawstring is going towards the back of the dress. And then I'll just pin this to the back of the dress so that it doesn't move while I'm working on the rest of the dress. So here's how the bodice looks with the drawstring in place. I think it looks really good, and now I'm going to move on to assembling the skirt. Now this skirt is quite a straightforward design. It's pretty simple to do. It's just made up of 4 panels, 2 in the front and 2 in the back. So I'm going to start by sewing together the front pieces along the center seam. Again, I'm using French seams to sew the skirt together, and then after I've sewn the 2 front pieces together, I will add the 2 back pieces to the front piece at the side seams. And with my skirt panels assembled, now I can sew the skirt to the bodice. So I'm going to match these together at the side seams of both the bodice and the skirt. And then as I pin this in place, I will adjust those gathering stitches in the bodice to fit to the skirt. I'm going to sew this together with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then I'm going to trim away my excess seam allowance and use a close together zigzag stitch to finish off the edge. So with the main part of the dress assembled, I'm going to move on to the sleeves. And the first step to making these sleeves is to add an elastic casing to the back of the sleeves. So you can see there's a marking here on the sleeve pattern for where to sew some bias tape to create a casing. So I made my own bias tape actually using the waist tie pieces from the dress that I decided I didn't want to use. And I'm just going to sew this onto the sleeve on either side of the bias tape. To make my life a little bit easier later on, I'm going to go ahead and fold and press a double hem along the edge of the sleeve. The pattern didn't say to do this yet. It has you hem it after you add the elastic. And I tried that on one of the sleeves and found it really difficult, so it made it a lot easier to have that pressed in place beforehand. I've cut some elastic that fits comfortably around my arm, and I'm going to use a safety pin to add this through the elastic casing, and I'll use some straight pins to hold this in place on either end so I don't accidentally pull it all the way through. Next, I'm going to match up the sleeve along the side seam, making sure I match those elastics together here. And then I'm going to pin this in place, making sure to unfold that hem right where the side seam will be. Then I'll sew this in place with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and trim off any excess seam allowance and use a zigzag stitch to finish off the edge. And while I'm at my sewing machine, I'm going to go ahead and add 2 rows of gathering stitches to the top of the sleeve between the markings so that I can turn this into a nice puffy sleeve in a few minutes. Now, several of the original Laura Ashley dresses that I've looked at have cotton lace detailing, and I had a little bit of lace in my fabric stash, so I'm going to go ahead and add this to the bottom edge of the sleeves by just overlaying that pressed up hem over the top of the lace, and then I'll pin this in place and stitch it down as I stitch the hem of the sleeves. Now, where the lace meets in the middle, I'm just making sure that one part is folded over the top of the other so that I can sew this together with some hand stitches later on and not have any raw edges of the lace. Next, I'm just going to use a few hand stitches to make sure that the edges of the lace are secured together. So now it's time to set the sleeves in, which is always really exciting, and I'm going to start by pulling up the gathering stitches, and then I will match up the side seam of the sleeve with the side seam of the dress. Then I'll pin the sleeve in place, adjusting the gathers to fit into the armhole, and then sew this down with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Before I move on to the back seam and the zipper, I'm going to use some zigzag stitches to finish off the back edge of the dress on both sides. So now it's time to sew the center back seam, and the first thing I'm going to do here is fold the dress with the right sides together and make sure that the waistline seam is matched up here so that everything is nice and even. Then I'm going to pin the back of the skirt together. There's a marking here of where you want to start your stitching to leave room for a zipper, so I'm just going to pin this entire length down the skirt. So with a regular stitch length and seam allowance, I'm going to sew that seam, but above that seam, I'm actually going to baste this together. So it's like you're sewing up the entire back of the dress, but the top part is just basted in place. And once that's been sewn, I'm just going to press the entire back of the dress open, and then it's time to install a zipper. Now, while I'm more used to using invisible zippers, I thought I would follow the traditional zipper instructions in this pattern, so I'm using a standard zipper here. And I'm going to start by pinning the zipper behind the basted seam and making sure that I'm matching the edges of the zipper tape to the edges of my seam that I sewed before. The center of the zipper should be right on that seam line that we sewed before, and now I'm just going to use some hand stitches to baste this in place so that it's a little bit easier to sew down here in a few minutes. Now, I couldn't find a zipper that was an exact match for my fabric, so the one I'm using doesn't actually match very well at all, but it's a neutral color, and I feel like in the end you can't see it very well, so it kind of works. So once I've basted all of this in place, I'm going to take the dress over to my sewing machine and sew the zipper in on the sewing machine. I am sewing this down with a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance between my presser foot and that center seam line. This makes sure that I don't sew over those zipper teeth and accidentally break my zipper or my needle. Then I'm just going to pivot at the end of the zipper and then sew back up the other side. And once I remove the basting stitches, you can see that zipper is set in place really neatly. Then the last thing I'm going to do to finish up the back of the dress is just tack down those edges of the zipper so that they don't stick out of the top of my dress, and then also add a hook and eye to help the back close a little bit more neatly. So at this point, I had tried the dress on, and while I loved the floor length long look, I thought that would actually prevent me from wearing this dress in my daily life. So I decided that it needed to have about 7 inches removed from the length. So I'm trimming away 6 inches from the length, and then I'm going to do a 1-inch hem by folding this up a 1/2 of an inch twice and sewing down a hem on my sewing machine. can see me get my phone out here to take a quick clip of this project for TikTok. So if you want to see shorter versions of my projects, I do share those over there if you're curious. But once the hem was sewn in place, this project was done, and I'm so pleased with how it turned out. I love the kind of historical Regency style of it, but I think it still reads in the modern era. So I really like that. It's a really fun dress to wear, and I'm really looking forward to wearing it throughout the summer. I think the length turned out really well as well, and I like how it looks with wedge sandals. Now, while I was filming this, my mom's garden is absolutely beautiful and is in full bloom right now, so I thought that was the perfect setting for filming some clips of this dress. So I hope you enjoy a few little clips of some flowers in here as well. I am so happy with how this dress came together, and I think it was really the perfect time to work on a project like this because I've been noticing a lot of similar kind of Regency-esque styles coming into the stores lately. I don't know if that has to do with the Bridgerton popularity and that maybe having an effect on the fashion industry, but anyway, I thought it was a good time to work on a project like this, and I'm really excited to wear it throughout the summer months. It's just so comfortable and light and breezy. I think I'm going to get a lot of use out of it, but I hope you guys enjoyed seeing how this project came together. If you are new to my channel and have not yet subscribed, you can go ahead and do that by clicking the red button down below, and I would really appreciate it if you were interested. And if you'd like to keep up with me outside of YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram are the two best places to do that. So I will link to all of that down below in case you are curious. Thank you again so much for watching and hanging out here on my channel today, and I will talk to you in the next video. Bye.